The man knelt before his brother and seized both wrists, not to strike, not to punish, but because those hands had just betrayed him. Autumn 1873, Coldwater Peak, Montana Territory. The cabin sat at the edge of the world, perched on a granite shelf where the pines thinned and the sky opened into something too vast for most people to bear. Below, the valley stretched toward a town that was little more than a smudge of wood and chimney smoke against the October gold. Above, the mountains climbed into clouds that never fully left. Everett Harlow had lived on this mountain for 12 years. He had built the cabin with his own hands when he was 20 years old, cutting timber, in the first frost hauling stone from the creek bed, fitting each log so tight the wind couldn't find a seam. He had built it for one reason, and that reason was sitting at the carving bench with his back turned, a knife in one hand and a block of oak in the other, completely unaware that his older brother was standing 3 feet behind him with a crumpled letter and a face like a coming storm. Everett was the larger of the two brothers, and large was an understatement. He stood 6 feet and 6 inches in his boots, with shoulders broad enough to block a doorframe and hands that could crush a man's fist inside his own. His beard was dark and thick, trimmed only when it caught in his rifle strap, and his eyes never stopped moving. They swept the tree line. They checked the trail. They measured every shadow that fell across the clearing. They were the eyes of a man who had spent 12 years watching for danger and who had found it more than once. But right now, those eyes were locked on the letter. The handwriting was beautiful. Precise, elegant, each letter formed with the care of someone who understood that words on paper were precious. The ink was black on yellowed stock, and the sentences ran in clean lines from margin to margin without a single cross-out or hesitation. Everett recognized the handwriting. He had seen it on shopping lists pinned to the cabin wall. He had seen it on labels tied to jars of preserved berries. He had seen it in the margins of his mother's old books, where careful annotations explained words that a boy who could not hear had taught himself to read. His brother had written this letter, his deaf brother, the brother who had never spoken a word in 26 years of life. The brother Everett had carried up this mountain to keep safe from a world that called him an animal. And this letter, this beautiful, eloquent, devastating letter, had brought a woman to their door. Everett stormed into the cabin. The warmth hit him first. The fire was low but steady, the way Callum always kept it, and the air smelled of pine resin and fresh wood shavings. The carving bench dominated the far wall, covered in curls of pale oak and the fine dust of hours of precise work. Small figures lined the shelf above it. A deer standing alone. A mountain range with a gap between two peaks. A pair of hands reaching toward each other, but not quite touching. Callum sat with his back to the door, bent over his work. His shoulders were narrower than his brother's, but corded with the lean muscle of a craftsman. His hair was lighter brown with threads of auburn that caught the firelight like copper wire. His hands moved with a precision that bordered on impossible. The knife turned, the wood whispered, and a shape emerged from the grain as if it had been waiting there all along. Everett shouted, "Callum, who told you to write that letter?" His voice filled the cabin. It bounced off the log walls and rattled the tin cups hanging by the stove. It was the kind of voice that stopped bears in their tracks, that sent elk crashing through underbrush half a mile away. Callum did not turn around. He did not flinch. He did not move at all, because he had not heard a single sound. Everett crossed the cabin in 2 strides. He grabbed both of Callum's wrists, one in each massive hand, and turned his brother to face him. The carving knife clattered to the floor. A half-finished bird tumbled into the wood shavings, face to face, close enough to feel each other's breath. Everett signed, not the formal flowing language of schools and institutions, but something rougher, something built by 2 boys on a mountaintop with no teacher and no book. 60 signs, maybe 70. Enough for survival. Eat, sleep, danger, go, stay, animal, water, fire, good, bad. His hands were shaking with anger, and the signs came fast and hard, a finger jabbing at the letter, then at his own eyes, then at his brother's chest. Again, "You wrote." What? Callum looked at him. He did not look afraid. He looked like a man who had expected this moment and had decided to let it come. Then Callum signed back. One sign, a single gesture that Everett himself had invented when they were boys sitting by their mother's bed in the last winter of her life. The right hand placed flat against the left side of the chest, fingers spread pressing gently over the heart. It meant please. I am asking you." And the woman standing in the cabin doorway watched all of it. She stood with a traveling bag over one shoulder and dust on the hem of her dark brown dress. She was not tall, 5'3", maybe less, with auburn hair, pinned low at her neck in the practical style of someone who worked with her hands all day. Her face was young but not innocent in the way that word usually meant. There was knowledge in her eyes, the kind that comes from watching people who cannot speak learn to say everything that matters. She did not understand the signs. They were not the signs she knew. But she understood something deeper than vocabulary or grammar. She understood form. She understood that two hands moving through empty air could carry more meaning than 1,000 shouted words. These hands were talking. And she, Lenore Ashfield, 22 years old, daughter of a minister who ran a school for the deaf in Philadelphia, had spent her entire life learning how to listen to hands. Everett turned to her. His face was granite. His voice was flat. "You need to leave. This was a mistake. There was no advertisement." Lenore did not look at Everett. She looked past him, past his enormous frame blocking half the cabin, to the younger man sitting at the carving bench with sawdust in his hair and an expression on his face that she had seen 100 times before on 100 children in 100 classrooms. The expression of someone who has something to say and no one to say it to. She raised both hands. Not the rough improvised signs of two brothers on a mountain, something else entirely. American Sign Language. Standardized. Taught in schools from Hartford to Philadelphia. Used by thousands of deaf Americans. A real language with grammar and syntax and the power to hold every thought a human mind could form. She signed slowly. Each gesture clear and deliberate, shaped for someone who might not know the formal vocabulary, but would recognize the intent. "I hear you." Callum Harlow stood up so fast his chair fell backward and hit the floor with a crack like a rifle shot. His eyes went wide. Not with fear, not with confusion, with something that had no name in any of the 60 signs his brother had given him, because Everett had never made a sign for what Callum was feeling in this moment. It was the look of a man who had been trapped in a room his entire life and had just watched someone open a window he did not know existed. He signed back, fast, urgent, in the rough mountain language he and Everett had built together. Lenore did not understand the specific meaning, but she understood the form. She understood that this man was fluent in gesture, fluent in physical expression, fluent in the art of making air speak. He just had never met anyone outside his own cabin who shared that fluency. She signed again, slowly, word by word. "I will learn your signs, you will learn my signs." Then she smiled. Callum turned to Everett. His hands were trembling so badly that the sign he made was barely legible. But Everett had been reading his brother's hands for 26 years, and he read this one clearly. "She hears me." Everett Harlow stood in his own cabin, in the home he had built with his own hands, to protect the one person he loved most in the world, and he felt two things at the same time. Both were real, both were true, and they pulled in opposite directions with the force of two horses hitched to the same post. Gratitude. Because for the first time in Callum's life, someone from outside their two-person world understood that his brother was not broken, not empty, not an animal. Someone had walked through the door and in 30 seconds had given Callum something Everett had failed to give him in 26 years. The feeling of being heard by a stranger. And fear. Because if Callum could be heard, if Callum could speak, if Callum could tell someone what his hands had been holding for 8 years, then the secret that kept them safe on this mountain would walk down into the valley and blow their world apart. The firelight flickered. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a sound like breathing. And in the doorway, the woman with the practical hair and the dusty dress stood with her hands still raised, as if she had not yet finished what she came to say. She had not. Not by a long distance. Day 2 on Coldwater Peak began with a language lesson, unlike anything that had ever taken place in the history of either American Sign Language or the Harlow brothers' private mountain dialect. Lenore sat across from Callum at the carving bench. Between them lay a blank sheet of paper and a pencil worn down to half its length. The morning light came through the cabin's single east-facing window and fell across the table in a bar of gold, illuminating the fine sawdust that floated in the air like tiny planets orbiting a quiet sun. They talked. Or rather, they attempted something that was not quite talking and not quite teaching, but something in between, something that wove two separate languages together the way a weaver crosses threads from two different looms. Lenore signed an ASL. Callum watched her hands with the absolute focus of a hawk tracking movement on the ground. He did not understand the signs, but he understood that they were signs. He understood the grammar of gesture, the way meaning lived in the movement of fingers, in the angle of palms, in the position of hands relative to the body. When he did not understand, Lenore drew. A quick sketch on the paper, a sun with rays for day, a crescent moon for night, a stick figure with lines radiating from its head for afraid. And when Callum understood, he signed back, in his own language, the rough, beautiful, limited language of two brothers who had built an entire system of communication from nothing but love and necessity. Lenore wrote everything down. Harlow sign number 14 equals ASL word for danger. Harlow sign number 7 equals ASL word for safe. Harlow sign number 32 equals ASL word for come here. Two languages. One created in a school in Philadelphia by hundreds of deaf people working together over decades. The other created on a mountaintop in Montana by two brothers who had no one else. And here on a sheet of paper covered in pencil marks and quick sketches, they met for the first time. Each of Callum's signs told a story. His sign for danger was identical to the way Everett waved his arms when he spotted a bear on the ridge. His sign for safe was two hands wrapping around each other like arms in an embrace, the image of a mother holding a small boy. Lenore recognized it instantly and had to look away for a moment to keep her composure. Then came the moment that changed everything. Not the secret, not the revelation that would come later. Something smaller, but in its own way just as important. Lenore taught Callum two new signs, good and bad, simple, fundamental. The building blocks of opinion, of judgment, of having a voice that could evaluate the world. Callum learned them both in under a minute. His hands were quick, his mind quicker. He repeated each sign twice to confirm, then nodded. Then he looked around the cabin. His gaze landed on the bowl of porridge Everett had made that morning, still sitting half-eaten on the table near the stove. Cold, gray, lumpy. The kind of porridge that tasted like punishment. Callum pointed at the porridge, looked at Lenore, and signed, bad. His eyes sparkled, not with sadness, not with the quiet desperation she had expected from a man trapped in silence for 26 years. With mischief, pure, deliberate, fully intentional mischief. Lenore laughed. The sound filled the cabin and startled a jay off the windowsill outside. Everett, standing in the doorway with an armload of firewood, looked at the two of them. He did not understand the sign. He did not know what was funny, but he saw something he had never seen before in all the years on this mountain. His brother was laughing with someone who was not him. Lenore recovered, wiped her eyes, and handed Callum a book from her bag. A primer on American history. Nothing special, the kind of thing you might find in any schoolroom in Pennsylvania. She expected him to look at the pictures, maybe recognize a few words. Callum opened the book and read. His eyes moved across the lines with the speed and comprehension of someone who had been reading for years, which, as it turned out, he had. Over 30 books. Every volume his mother had owned before she died, read and reread in the silence of this cabin while the snow piled against the windows and the fire burned low. Lenore watched him read. Then she turned to Everett, and her voice carried a tremor that was not fear but something closer to outrage at what the world had assumed about this man. Did you know your brother reads and writes this well? Everett set the firewood down. Callum read every book our mother left behind. More than 30. Lenore looked back at Callum, who had already turned 2 pages and was running his finger under a passage about the Continental Congress with the intensity of a man drinking water after 3 days in the desert. He is not mute, Mr. Harlow. He is not stupid. He has never had a language large enough for what he needs to say. In the silence that followed, Lenore noticed the bird. On the carving bench, half buried in wood shavings, lay the figure that had fallen when Everett grabbed Callum's wrists. She picked it up. It was a dove, carved from oak small enough to fit in the palm of her hand. The head and body were exquisite, smoothed and shaped with a craftsman's patience. But the wings were wrong. They were pressed flat against the body, tight sealed, as if bound there, and the beak was closed. Not just closed, clamped shut, deliberately, purposefully silent. Lenore held the bird up, signed, "What is this?" Callum looked at the dove in her hands. His expression shifted, the mischief drained away, and something older took its place. Something that had been sitting in his chest for 3 years since the day he started carving it. He signed slowly, mixing his own language with the few ASL signs he had learned that morning. Bird, dove, but it cannot sing, so I do not finish it. Lenore set the dove back on the bench. She did not ask why. Not yet. She had learned from her father, who had spent 30 years teaching deaf children, that the most important rule of communication was the simplest one. Hands first. Let the hands speak first. The questions come after. She did not know it yet, but she would use that phrase 3 more times before the story was over. And each time it would mean something larger than the time before. Night fell on Coldwater Peak the way it falls everywhere in the high mountains of Montana in October. Fast, cold, and absolute. The stars came out in numbers that city people would not believe, so many and so bright that the sky looked less like a ceiling and more like a floor covered in broken glass. Callum was asleep. He slept the way deaf people often sleep, deeply and without the interruptions that sound inflicts on everyone else. The cabin was warm. The fire was banked. The carving bench was clean, tools aligned in a precise row. The unfinished dove sitting at the end like a period at the close of an unfinished sentence. Lenore sat on the porch. Her notebook was open on her knees, and she was planning tomorrow's lesson by the light of a candle stub wedged into a tin can. The cold bit at her fingers, but she did not go inside. She needed to think. And thinking for Lenore Ashfield required moving her hands. Everett came out. He leaned against the porch post and said nothing for a long time. The silence of a man who has lived inside it for so many years that he has forgotten how to begin a conversation. When he finally spoke, his voice was not angry. It was careful. The voice of someone handling something fragile. "You are teaching my brother to talk," Lenore looked up. "I am teaching him standardized sign language, so he can communicate with more people than just you." "Callum does not need more people. Callum needs to be safe." "Safe and lonely are not the same thing, Mr. Harlow." Silence. The wind pushed through the pines. An owl called from somewhere down the ridge, and another answered from across the valley. Everett's voice changed. The careful tone cracked, and underneath it was something raw. Not anger at Lenore, anger at memory. "You do not know what the world out there does to my brother." They called him an animal. They threw rocks at him when he was 10 years old because he did not answer when they spoke to him. Once they tied a rope around his neck and led him around the town square like a toy, 10 years old, because he was not a person to them. He did not understand their language, so he was not human. He stopped. His jaw worked, his hands hanging at his sides, clenched into fists the size of small boulders. "I brought him up here so no one would ever call him that again." Lenore was quiet for a long time. The candle guttered. When she spoke, her voice was low, but it did not waver. "I grew up in a school for deaf children, Mr. Harlow. I watched parents drop their children at the gate and never come back. I know exactly what the world does." She paused, let the silence hold. "But my father taught me something. The answer is not to hide deaf people from the world. The answer is to give deaf people a language powerful enough that the world has to listen." Everett did not reply. He went inside, closed the door. Not a slam, quieter than a slam. The soft click of a latch that said more than any slammed door ever could. Two philosophies. Two ways of loving someone who the world had decided was less than human. Hide them or arm them. Both born from the same place. Both wrong in their own way. Both right in their own way. And between them, asleep in a cabin on a mountain in Montana, a man with bright, watchful eyes and gifted hands held a secret that would test both philosophies to their breaking point. Days 3 and 4 passed in a rhythm that Lenore established with the quiet authority of someone who had been teaching all her life. Morning language lessons. Lenore sat across from Callum at the carving bench, and she taught him the signs for feelings. The things that his brother's 60 rough gestures had never been able to hold. Happy, both hands brushing upward against the chest rising. Callum made the sign and smiled. Not the small, private smile she had seen before. A real smile, wide and sudden. The smile of a man who had just been given a word for something he had felt his entire life, but could never name. The narrator of this story asks you to hold that image for a moment. A 26-year-old man sitting in a cabin he has barely left since childhood, learning for the first time how to say, "I am happy," with his hands. And the smile that came with it did not begin at his mouth. It began at his fingertips. Sad. Both hands drawing downward before the face falling. Callum made the sign, then stopped. His eyes went wet. He made the sign again, slower, and again, and again, and again, 5 times, 6 times, as if he were signing the word sad once for every year he had carried sadness without a name for it. 26 repetitions would not have been enough. Afraid. Both hands springing open before the chest, a startled gesture the body's instinct captured in formal language. Callum made the sign, and then he looked out the window. Not at the mountains, not at the skikoi, at the valley below, toward the town. His hands trembled, not from the effort of learning, from something else, something specific. Lenore noticed. She wrote it in her notebook and drew a line under it. She did not ask. Not yet. Hands first. The questions come after. On the 4th day, Lenore taught the signs for beautiful and ugly. Callum absorbed them instantly. Then he looked around the cabin with the evaluating eye of an artist. His gaze landed on the pair of elk antlers Everett had mounted on the wall above the door. The cabin's only decoration, if you could call it that. Dusty, lopsided, one tine broken off. Callum pointed at the antlers, signed ugly, then pointed at his own carvings on the shelf, the deer, the mountains, the reaching hands, signed beautiful. He shrugged. His face was perfectly innocent, perfectly deadpan. The face of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and was enjoying every second of it. Lenore bit her lip to keep from laughing, and Callum watched her bite her lip. His eyes, the eyes that had spent 26 years learning to read what voices could not tell him, caught the suppressed laughter in the way her jaw tensed, and the way her nostrils flared slightly, and the way a single small crease appeared at the corner of her mouth. He was not just funny, he was observant enough to know he was funny. He read reactions the way other people read newspapers, and he used that knowledge not for pity, not for manipulation, but for the simple human pleasure of making someone laugh. From the doorway, Everett watched. He saw his brother teaching the stranger a sign. He saw the stranger suppress a smile. He saw his brother's eyes track her face with a perception so acute it was almost frightening. And he saw something else. Something that made his chest ache in a way he could not name, because he too lacked the vocabulary for what he was feeling. His brother was building a connection with someone, a private connection, a shared language of humor and observation and subtle intelligence that excluded Everett entirely. For 12 years, Everett had been the only person in Callum's world. The only interpreter, the only bridge, the only voice. Now someone else was building a bridge, and the bridge was wider than his. That night, after Lenore had gone to sleep in the small side room Everett had cleared for her, Callum sat by the fire. He took the unfinished dove from the bench, turned it in his hands, studied it. Then he picked up his finest sanding tool and began to smooth the head. Gently, carefully, the way you would stroke the hair of someone you loved. Not opening the wings, not yet, not opening the beak, but tending to what was already there, as if preparing it for what was to come. Hope, small, cautious, but present. On the morning of the 5th day, Lenore found a note on her work table. Callum had been leaving them every morning since her 2nd day on the mountain. Small sheets of paper torn from a ledger book. Sometimes questions, sometimes observations, sometimes just a single sentence that sat on the page like a stone in a stream, complete and unmoving. This morning's note read, "You came because of the letter. But was my letter truth or seductions? I write better than I am. On paper, I am not deaf." Lenore sat with the note for a long time. The fire crackled. Outside, Everett was splitting wood, the steady thunk of the axe marking the seconds like a clock. Then she wrote beneath his words in her own clear hand, "On paper, I am not a minister's daughter whose stepmother sent her away. We are both better on paper. But I want to know the real person." She left the note on the table and went outside to prepare the afternoon's lesson. That afternoon, Callum sat across from her at the carving bench. But he did not sit the way he had sat before. On every previous day, he had positioned himself at an angle half turned away, his body still carrying the habit of 26 years of keeping his back to a world that could not understand him. Today he sat facing her, directly, fully, his eyes on her eyes, his hands on the table between them, palms up, ready. He did not sign anything. He did not write anything. He simply turned his chair around and sat down facing the woman who had read his words and written back. A man who cannot speak the word trust finds other ways to say it. Callum Harlow said it with a chair. The trouble came that same afternoon wearing a smile and a silver badge. Everett had taken Lenore down to the town of Coldwater to buy supplies at Opal Bryce's general store. Callum stayed at the cabin. He had not set foot in Coldwater in 12 years, and Everett did not ask him to start now. Opal Bryce was 62 years old, built like a fence post, and possessed of the kind of prairie pragmatism that treated every problem as either solvable or ignorable. She had been selling supplies to Everett for over a decade, and she was the only merchant in Coldwater who kept a pencil and a scrap of paper on the counter at all times, so that when Callum occasionally came down with his brother, they could communicate through writing. She liked the Harlow brothers. She did not pity them. She treated Callum the way she treated everyone else, as a customer who deserved correct change and fresh coffee. Lenore was examining a shelf of preserved goods when the front door opened and a man walked in wearing a well-tailored charcoal suit and a sheriff's badge polished to a mirror shine. Ward Selden was 48 years old. He was not physically imposing, not tall, not broad, not the kind of man who dominated a room with his body. He dominated it with something else. Warmth. Practice-calibrated, pitch-perfect warmth. His smile arrived before he did, and it was the kind of smile that made people feel seen, feel valued, feel safe. His hair was salt and pepper combed neatly with a precise part. His eyes were gray, pale gray, the color of river ice, and they were warm too, on the surface. Everett Harlow. The voice was genuine delight, or something so close to genuine delight that no one in Coldwater had ever detected the difference. It has been too long since you came down from that mountain. How are things up on Coldwater Peak? He crossed the store in 3 easy strides and clapped Everett on the shoulder. The gesture was familiar, friendly, the gesture of a man who considered himself a friend to everyone. Everett's entire body went rigid. Not a flinch, not a step back, just a sudden, complete stillness, like an animal that has spotted a predator and is calculating whether to fight, or freeze. Fine, Everett said. His voice was flat. Selden's gaze moved to Lenore. He studied her for exactly 1 second too long. Then the smile widened. And who is this, a new face in Coldwater? We do not get many young women up in this part of Montana. He extended a hand. Ward Selden, Sheriff. If you need anything at all while you are here, anything whatsoever, please do not hesitate to ask. Lenore shook his hand. Thank you, Mr. Selden. Are you visiting the Harlows passing through? Before Lenore could answer, Everett stepped forward, slightly, just enough to put his body between Selden and Lenore without making it obvious. She is nobody, just passing through. Selden looked at Everett, then at Lenore, then back at Everett. His smile did not change, but something behind it shifted the way a shadow shifts when the light source moves. Of course. He turned back toward Lenore with an expression of mild concern. Your brother is up there alone, Everett. I hope he is all right. The town still thinks about him. We worry. He lowered his voice, just enough to make it feel confidential. If you ever need anything for him, anything at all, you know where to find me. The words were kind, the tone was kind. Everything about Ward Selden was kind. And Everett Harlow, who had killed bears with his bare hands and survived winters that would have ended, most men looked at the kind sheriff and something in his face changed. It was not anger. It was not defiance. It was something worse than both. It was fear. Selden patted the counter as he left. Mrs. Bryce, that campaign poster looks wonderful in your window. Thank you for your support. He tipped his hat, smiled at Lenore one more time, and walked out into the afternoon sun. The bell above the door jingled, then silence. Opal Bryce waited until the sound of Selden's boots faded on the wooden sidewalk. Then she leaned across the counter and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. He asked about your brother this morning. Asked Deputy Goss specifically whether the new woman on Coldwater Peak knows how to talk with her hands. She paused. I do not know what that means, Everett. But I know that when Ward Selden asks a specific question, he already knows the answer. He is not asking to learn. He is asking to confirm. Everett stood very still, his hands hanging at his sides slowly closed into fists, then opened, then closed again. A man trying to hold something that kept slipping away. Lenore watched him. She did not yet understand why the sheriff's smile had made the strongest man she had ever met afraid. She did not yet know about the trail on the east side of the mountain. She did not yet know about the gunshot that made no sound for the boy who could not hear. She did not yet know about 8 years of silence that had nothing to do with deafness and everything to do with survival. But she would, soon. Outside, the sun moved across the main street of Coldwater, casting long shadows from the wooden buildings and the hitching posts and a campaign poster nailed to the wall of the feed store. Selden for judge, a man of law and order. And on the same street 3 doors down from Opal Bryce's store, there was a small house that was always closed. A house where a woman named Martha Cruz taught piano every Tuesday afternoon, where the curtains were always drawn and the front porch was always swept and a single chair sat empty beside the piano bench. The chair had been empty for 8 years. It was the chair where Elias Cruz used to sit while his wife played turning the pages of the sheet music with hands still rough from hauling pelts. He had died on a mountain trail. His horse had thrown him. That was what the sheriff's report said. That was what everyone believed. Martha Cruz had spent 8 years blaming her dead husband for being careless on a mountain trail. She did not know that carelessness had nothing to do with it. She did not know that the truth was sitting on a mountaintop locked inside the hands of a man who had never been able to tell anyone what he saw. But the clock was ticking. 12 days had become 7. And somewhere between the language of hands and the language of law, a woman with a dusty dress and a practical bun was about to become the voice that the silence had been waiting for. On the ridge above Coldwater, Everett Harlow stood in the fading light and watched his brother and the teacher through the cabin window. Lenore's hands moved in the air, shaping signs. Callum's hands answered tentative but growing surer with every repetition. 2 sets of hands speaking 2 different languages, finding each other in the space between. It was beautiful, and it was the most dangerous thing Everett had ever seen. Because if Callum learned to speak, if Callum found a voice that the world could understand, then the secret that had kept them alive for 8 years would no longer be a secret. And the man with the kind smile and the silver badge would come for them. 7 days, the countdown had begun, and on the carving bench inside the cabin, a small wooden dove sat with its wings pressed tight against its body and its beak sealed shut, waiting for someone to give it permission to sing. On the 6th day, Lenore taught Callum the sign for witness. She had been building toward this moment without knowing it. The first 3 days were foundations, emotions, simple verbs, the vocabulary of feeling. But language is not just feeling, language is structure. And structure is what turns a scream into a statement and a gesture into testimony. Witness. The dominant hand held flat, 2 fingers extended, drawn away from the eyes and outward as if pulling sight itself from the body and laying it before the world. Callum watched her demonstrate the sign. He repeated it once, twice. His hands, as always, were precise. His fingers moved with the economy of a craftsman who understood that every unnecessary motion was waste. But on the 3rd repetition, his hand stopped. Not a mistake, not a forgotten step, a decision. His fingers froze in the air halfway through the sign, and his eyes dropped from Lenore's hands to the table between them. Then his eyes moved to the window, then back to Lenore. His eyes were asking her something that his vocabulary, old and new combined, could not yet shape into signs. But Lenore had spent 18 years reading the faces of people who spoke without sound, and she understood the question before his hands could form it. He tried anyway. He signed, slowly stitching together old signs and new ones, like a man building a bridge from 2 different types of wood. I, witness, I saw. Bad thing, Lenore's heart began to beat faster. She kept her face still. She had spent 18 years learning to keep her face still when a student was reaching for something difficult because any reaction from the teacher, surprise, pity, excitement, could slam the door that was just beginning to open. She signed back. 1 question, the only question that mattered. You want to tell Callum? Looked at the door. Everett was hunting on the eastern ridge. He would not be back until late afternoon. The cabin was silent except for the fire and the small ticking sounds of wood contracting in the autumn cold. Callum looked back at Lenore and nodded. Not a hesitation, not a reluctant dip of the chin. A nod that came from somewhere deep, from 8 years of carrying something that had grown heavier with every passing season, every silent winter, every spring, when the snow melted and the mountain trails opened, and the man who had done the terrible thing walked through town shaking hands and smiling his kind smile and nobody knew. A nod that said, I have been waiting for this. I did not know I was waiting because I did not know this was possible. But now that you are here, now that your hands can carry what mine cannot, I am ready. And Callum Harlow began to tell the story he had held in silence for 8 years. He told it in pieces. Some inside the rough mountain dialect mixed with the new ASL vocabulary that was still fresh on his fingers. Some in writing when the signs were not enough, his pencil moving across the paper in the elegant hand that had once convinced a woman in Philadelphia that the man who wrote the letter must be a professor. It took an hour. The longest hour of Lenore's life. Callum told her about a trail, a morning, two men, one on horseback, one waiting, a gun, a body, money taken from a dead man's saddle, a crime disguised as an accident committed by a man who now wore a sheriff's badge and was running for the office of county judge. He told her the name of the dead man, Elias Cruz, and she remembered the small house on the main street of Coldwater with the always drawn curtains and the empty chair beside the piano. He told her the name of the killer, Ward Selden, and she understood all at once why Everett Harlow had looked at the kind sheriff in Opal Bryce's store and trembled. He told her that he had been 18 years old and hiding behind a boulder 20 yards away, and that the only reason he survived was the same reason he could never tell anyone what he saw. He was silent, the most silent a human being can be. The silence that comes not from choice, but from the body itself, from ears that have never carried sound and never will. And he told her that he had run home and told his brother everything in the 60 signs they had built together in drawings scratched in the dirt, in the desperate eyes of a boy who had just watched a man die. And that Everett had said no. No one can ever know. Callum wrote the last line on the paper and pushed it across the table. I told Everett with my hands. Everett said no one can ever know. Never. Lenore read the words. Then she read them again. The fire popped. A log settled. Outside, a hawk circled on a thermal above the ridge, patient and watchful. Lenore looked at Callum. Her eyes were wet. Not from sadness, from a fury so pure it had bypassed every other emotion on its way to the surface. She signed 8 years. You held this for 8 years. Callum signed back. The sign for Shandon. And the sign she had taught him 3 days ago on the third day of a new language and a new life, both hands drawing downward before the face. He signed it again, and again, and again, his hands pulling down through the air in front of his face over and over, a repetitive motion that stopped being language and became something closer to prayer, or the opposite of prayer, a reverse prayer pulling meaning down instead of sending it up. 8 years of grief compressed into a single gesture, repeated until the gesture itself began to crack under the weight. Lenore reached across the table and took both of his hands, caught them in the middle of the sign mid-fall, and held them still, her fingers wrapped around his. She did not squeeze. She did not pull. She simply held. Their eyes met, and in that cabin on a mountaintop in Montana, in the absolute silence that was not absence but presence, Lenore, Ashfield said the only thing that needed to be said without saying it at all. I heard you. You can stop now. I am here, clean and whole and sufficient. 2 pairs of hands held still, the most intimate gesture in a story built entirely on the movement of hands, the moment when the hands stopped moving. Lenore released his hands. She took a breath. Then she spoke the phrase her father had taught her, the rule that had governed every interaction she had ever had with a person who communicated through silence. Hands first. Your hands have told the story. Now let me write it in the language that courts have to hear. Day 7, countdown 6 days. Lenore wrote the formal testimony. She sat at the table with a clean sheet of paper and a pen she had brought from Philadelphia, and she wrote in the precise legal language her father had taught her when she was 16 years old and helping him draft petitions for the parents of deaf children who were fighting to keep their sons and daughters out of state asylums. She knew the format, she knew the vocabulary. She knew how to take the raw material of human experience and reshape it into the iron framework of legal evidence. Statement of witness, description of events, time, location, parties involved. Signature line. When she was done, she read it aloud to herself. Not because Callum could hear, because she needed to hear it. She needed to know that the words she had written carried the weight of what Callum's hands had told her. Then she wrote a second letter. This one was addressed to Judge Clement Sparrow, Circuit Court, Western District, Montana Territory. The letter explained that a witness had come forward in the matter of the death of Elias Cruz, previously ruled an accident 8 years prior. The witness was deaf. The witness communicated through American Sign Language. A qualified interpreter was available. The witness requested that the judge come to Coldwater Peak to take the testimony in person before the upcoming county election. She folded both letters, sealed them with candle wax, and gave them to Everett. These need to reach Opal Bryce. She will know how to send them. Everett looked at the letters. He did not open them. He did not ask what they said, but he delivered them. He walked down the mountain in the late afternoon light, left them with Opal, and walked back up before dark. He did not speak on the trail down. He did not speak on the trail up. He carried the letters the way a man carries a lit fuse, knowing that what was at the end of it would change everything, and choosing to carry it anyway. Day 8, countdown 5 days. The day the mountain broke open. Everett came back from hunting early. He walked into the cabin, still carrying his rifle, his coat still damp from the morning fog that clung to the eastern ridge. He stopped in the doorway. Lenore was sitting at the table. The testimony was spread before her. She was reviewing it, making small corrections in the margins, checking names and dates against the notes she had taken from Callum's account. Everett set his rifle against the wall. He crossed the cabin. He picked up the testimony. He read it. His face went white. Not pale, white, the color of birch bark, the color of snow that has never been touched. "What are you doing?" Lenore looked up. "Writing the testimony for Callum. He witnessed a murder 8 years ago. Sheriff Selden killed a man named Elias Cruz on the Eastern Trail and took $600 from him. Callum saw the whole thing. He could not tell anyone because he had no language that anyone would understand. But now he does, and this testimony will go before a federal circuit judge who has no connection to Selden and no reason to protect him." She said it clearly, precisely, the way she would present it to a court. Because she had been preparing for this moment since the day Callum's hands froze on the sign for witness. Everett stood very still. The fire crackled. The clock of wood and flame that measured their days ticked on. Then he said 2 words that split the story in half. "I know." The air in the cabin changed, heavy enough to bend the walls. The fire crackled, and even that sound seemed to flinch. Lenore stared at him. "You know," Everett sat down. The chair creaked under his weight. He put his hands on the table palms down and looked at them the way a man looks at tools that have failed him. "Callum told me the night it happened. He came running into the cabin. He grabbed my arms. He signed everything. Our signs, the rough ones. 60 signs are not enough to describe a murder, so he drew in the dirt. Drew a man falling, drew a bag of money, drew a star on a chest." Everett paused. "I understood." "Then why did you not go to the law?" Everett laughed. It was the worst sound Lenore had ever heard. The laugh of a man who has been asked a question he has answered in his own head every single night for 8 years and has never found an answer that lets him sleep. "The law came to me," he told her. A week after the killing, Selden rode up to the cabin. Alone, smiling, warm. He sat on the porch and drank coffee that Everett made, and he looked out at the mountains, and he talked about the weather and the elk migration and the price of beaver pelts. And then with the same casual warmth he used to discuss the weather, he said, "Everett, your brother uses that Eastern Trail quite a bit, does he not? I hope he has not seen anything out there that might be well inconvenient." He sipped his coffee. "Because if he did see something, I would have to report that he is not mentally stable. You understand, the territorial asylum in Helena accepts patients year-round, including those who cannot communicate." He finished his coffee. He complimented the view. He rode away. Everett stared at the tabletop. His voice was barely audible. "I chose silence. because between justice for a dead man and keeping my brother safe, I chose my brother." He swallowed. "Every day for 8 years, I watched Selden walk through that town like a hero, shaking hands, donating to the church, building the town stable with money that he took from a dead man's saddle. And I said nothing, because if I spoke, Callum goes to the asylum. And I have seen what they do to people in those places. They chain them to walls. They leave them in the dark. They treat them worse than the people in Coldwater ever did." His hands were shaking on the table, not with anger, with the exhaustion of a man who has been carrying a weight that was never meant for one person to carry alone. "You understand? Do you understand that choice?" Lenore was quiet for a long time, long enough for the fire to settle and the light to shift and the shadows on the cabin wall to change shape. When she spoke, her voice was steady but gentle. "I understand. You chose right with what you had at the time." She paused. "But now Callum has language. Now he has me, a certified interpreter. And the territorial asylum does not commit people who have a formal interpreter in a testimony accepted by a federal circuit judge." Everett looked at her. For the first time since she had arrived on this mountain, his eyes did not hold suspicion. They did not hold fear. They held something raw and exhausted and desperately grateful. He was looking at an ally. "Selden will not let this happen," he said. "If he finds out you are writing testimony, he will come for us." Lenore met his eyes. "Then he will come, and when he comes, Callum will be ready." That night, Everett did something he had never done in 8 years of shared silence. He told Callum the truth. The brothers sat across from each other at the table where Callum carved his birds and his mountains and his lonely deer. The fire was low. The cabin was dark except for the amber circle of light that the coals threw across the floor. Everett signed. The old signs, the mountain language. But he signed slowly, and his hands, the hands that were steady enough to drop an elk at 200 yards, were trembling. "I was silent because Selden threatened asylum for you." Callum watched his brother's hands. Read them the way he read everything, with total attention, with eyes that missed nothing. His expression changed. It moved through 3 stages in 5 seconds. Surprise, then understanding, then something harder. Anger, not the kind of anger that comes from betrayal, the kind of anger that comes from being underestimated by the person you trust most. Callum signed back, fast, hard, mixing the new ASL with the old mountain signs. His hands speaking a hybrid language that was neither formal nor rough, but something entirely his own. "You thought I was weak. You thought I could not survive. 8 years, you decided, for me, I did not get to choose." Everett signed, "I protected you." Callum signed one word, a word that required both hands moving together, twisting inward like turning a key in a lock. "You locked me." Then he signed the new word, the word Lenore had taught him 5 days ago, the word that had changed everything when it entered his vocabulary because it named the thing that Selden had stolen and Everett had buried. Truth. The hand moving from the mouth outward, pushing the word into the world. "Your truth of me. You locked my truth." The signs hung in the air between them, invisible but as solid as the cabin walls. Callum turned away. He picked up the wooden dove from the bench. He picked up his carving knife. And in the firelight, with his brother watching, he began to carve the first wing free. The knife cut into the oak with small, precise strokes. Shaving by shaving, the wing emerged from the body of the bird, not pressed flat any longer. Rising, opening, reaching upward and outward the way wings are meant to be. One wing open. The second wing stayed closed. The beak stayed shut. Half done, half told. Callum set the bird down and did not look at his brother. Everett stood up. He walked outside. He stood in the Montana dark with the stars scattered across the sky like salt spilled on a black table, and he breathed the cold air, and he felt something crack inside his chest that had been holding for 12 years. Lenore came out after him. She stood a few paces away. She did not speak. She stood with him and said nothing because she understood that there are moments when presence is the only language that works. Everett's voice, when it came, was almost inaudible. "I kept my brother safe for 12 years, and now I find out I was also keeping him in prison." He did not say anything else. Neither did she. They stood on the porch of a cabin on a mountaintop and listened to the wind move through the pines, and somewhere in the dark below them, the lights of Coldwater flickered, and a man with a kind smile and cold eyes was sleeping peacefully in a house built with stolen money, not yet knowing that the silence he had purchased 8 years ago was about to end. Day 9. Countdown 4 days. Ward Selden did not wait. He was not a man who waited. He was a man who planned, and when plans were threatened, he acted with the methodical precision of someone who had gotten away with murder for 8 years precisely because he never left anything to chance. The first move came in the morning. Deputy Goss rode up to the cabin carrying a folded broadsheet, an election notice inviting all citizens to vote for the office of county judge. A courtesy call. A neighborly visit. Goss was 30, lean and incurious. He did what Selden told him to do, and he did not ask why. He handed Everett the broadsheet. He looked around the cabin. He looked at Lenore. He looked at Callum. He looked at the papers on the table. Lenore had hidden the testimony under the ASL textbook, but the other notes, the scraps of paper where Callum had written his account, were scattered near the edge of the table, partially covered by wood shavings. Sheriff Selden wanted me to mention. Goss said, his voice carrying the flat recitation of a man delivering someone else's words, that the town has concerns about the young lady living on the mountain with 2 unmarried men. No chaperone, no family present. He says he can help arrange more appropriate accommodations. Everett stood in the doorway. His body filled it the way it always did, a wall of muscle and intention. Tell Selden to mind his own business. Goss nodded unfazed. He left. Callum sat at his bench throughout the visit. He could not hear a word that was spoken. But he watched. He watched Goss's eyes, and he saw something that no one else in the cabin caught. A flicker. A pause. The involuntary halt of a gaze landing on something it was sent to find. After Goss was gone, Callum picked up a piece of paper and wrote quickly in his clean, elegant hand and handed it to Lenore. That man. When he looked at the papers on the table, his eyes stopped at the third sheet from the top, the one with the name Cruz on it. His eyes stopped for 2 seconds. He knows that name. He was looking for it. Lenore read the note, looked at Callum. He shrugged, then signed in, mixing ASL and mountain language with a fluency that was growing by the hour. I cannot hear, but I see more than people who can. It was not self-pity. It was not even pride. It was a simple statement of fact delivered with the same dry precision that had led him to sign Moa bad while pointing at Everett's porridge 4 days earlier. A man who understood his own abilities and used them without apology. Lenore folded the note carefully and put it in her pocket. One more piece of evidence, one more thread in the net she was weaving. The second move came that afternoon. Deputy Goss returned. This time he did not come inside. He left a package on the porch. A small book, leather-bound, stamped with the territorial seal of Montana. Regulations governing the Montana Territorial Asylum for the Insane. One page was marked with a folded corner. Chapter 4. Procedures for the commitment of patients deemed incapable of communication. A note was tucked inside the front cover. Handwritten. The penmanship was neat and unhurried. Everett, I thought you might find Chapter 4 of interest. Sleep well. W.S. Everett picked up the book. His hand squeezed it so hard his knuckles went white. He looked at Lenore. He is not just talking about the asylum anymore. He has the paperwork. Lenore took the book from him. She opened it to Chapter 4 and read the relevant passage. Then she closed it and set it on the table. Her face was calm. Her hands were not. He is scared, she said. A man who sends threats through official documents is a man who knows that words alone are no longer enough. He is escalating because he can feel the ground shifting under him. She was right, but being right and being safe were not the same thing, not with 4 days left. The third move was quieter and more devastating than either of the first two. Opal Bryce sent a message up the mountain that evening, carried by the same boy who delivered supplies every week. 2 pieces of news, both bad. First, Selden had been spreading rumors through the town, not openly, not in his own voice. He simply mentioned his concerns to one person who mentioned them to 3 people, who mentioned them and to them to everyone. The girl from back east, the Harlow brothers, strange goings-on, hand signals and witchcraft, a vulnerable young woman under the influence of 2 mountain hermits. Someone should do something. Second, and worse, Selden had written a letter to Philadelphia, to Reverend Hugh Ashfield. Lenore's father. The letter expressed the deep concern of Coldwater's sheriff for the Reverend's daughter who was living without chaperone or marriage certificate with two unmarried men on a remote mountaintop. A matter of honor, a matter of decency, a matter the letter implied without stating directly of a father's responsibility. Lenore did not know about the letter to her father, but the audience knows, and the audience knows something else. Opal's message contained a final line written quickly, the ink smeared as if her hand had been trembling. Your father has already replied. He is making arrangements to come to Montana, to take you home. That night, Lenore sat alone by the fire while both brothers slept. She held Opal's message in her hands and read it again. Her father, the man who had taught her ASL when she was 4 years old, the man who had dedicated his life to giving deaf children a voice, the man who loved her more than anything in the world. And that love was about to destroy everything. Because when Hugh Ashfield arrived in Coldwater, he would find his unmarried daughter living with two unmarried men on a mountaintop. He would find a town whispering about witchcraft and impropriety. He would find a sheriff expressing grave moral concern, and he would do what any loving father in 1873 would do. He would take her home, before Callum could testify, before Selden could be stopped, before any of it mattered. Lenore looked at Callum asleep by the wall. His eyes closed, his hands resting palm up on the blanket, as if, even in sleep, they were ready to speak. She looked at Everett asleep near the door, one arm over his face, the other hand wrapped around the stock of his rifle, guarding even in unconsciousness. Then she took a clean sheet of paper and wrote, fast, her hand trembling, but her letter steady. Father, I am safe. I am doing the work you taught me. I am giving a deaf man his voice. Please wait 5 more days. I will explain everything. But if you come now, an innocent man will lose his only chance to be heard. She sealed the letter and set it on the table for Everett to carry down to Opal in the morning. She had just bet everything, her relationship with her father, her reputation, her future, all of it on the table, stacked on the chance that 5 days would be enough. 4 days to the election. The countdown was accelerating, and the net that Lenore had been weaving, the careful web of ASL lessons and legal testimony and letters to distant judges, was about to be tested by a man who had killed once and would not hesitate to kill again, if killing was what it took to keep his secrets buried. Day 10. Countdown 3 days. The morning note on Lenore's table was different from the others. It was not a question. It was not an observation. It was a request. A single line written in Callum's beautiful hand. What is the sign for forgive? Lenore showed him. The dominant hand sweeping across the open palm of the other hand, like brushing something away, like clearing a surface, like erasing a mark that should not have been there. Callum repeated the sign, slowly, again, not because he had not learned it, because he was feeling the word take shape in his body. Learning a sign is not like learning a spoken word. A spoken word lives in the mouth. A sign lives in the muscles and the tendons and the bones. To learn a sign is to let a word inhabit your body like a guest moving into a room. He signed forgive a 3rd time. Then he looked out the window where Everett was splitting wood in the clearing. The axe rose and fell with the steady rhythm of a man who found peace in repetition, whose body knew how to work even when his mind was at war. Lenore understood. This was not about vocabulary. This was about one man needing to say one word to one person. She said it softly, the phrase that had governed her entire life, the phrase her father had given her like a compass. Hands first. Let your hands speak first. I will not interfere. Callum stood. He walked out of the cabin and across the clearing to where Everett was working. The axe stopped. Everett looked up, the blade embedded in a round of pine, his hand still gripping the handle. The two brothers faced each other. Morning light between them. The mountains rising behind them on both sides, enormous and indifferent. Callum raised his hands, and for the first time in his life, he spoke to his brother in a language that was not theirs, not the 60 signs of their shared mountain dialect. American Sign Language, the real language, the language of thousands, the language that Lenore had given him in 10 days. He signed you, protected, me, pause. I forgive, you, longer pause. But now I choose. Everett watched his brother's hands move through signs he did not fully understand. That was the point. That was the meaning beneath the meaning. For the first time, Callum was speaking in a language that Everett had not invented, had not controlled, could not fully interpret. His little brother had outgrown the cage, and the cage had been built with love, but it was still a cage. Lenore stood on the porch. She did not translate. She let Callum speak for himself. Let Everett understand what he could from the expression on his brother's face, and the movement of his brother's hands, and the tears that were running down his brother's cheeks without a sound. Everett released the axe handle. He put one hand on Callum's shoulder, gripped it, the grip of a man who had held on for 12 years and was now learning the hardest lesson of his life. He let go. That afternoon, Everett picked up his hat and his rifle. He looked at Lenore. "I'm going down to town." "What for?" "Selden is watching Opal. If she has been intercepted, your letter to the judge will never arrive. The letter to your father might not reach the post office either." He checked the rifle's action, a habitual movement, the unconscious ritual of a man who measured danger in calibers. "I'm going to Opal first. Then I will ride to Carson Creek myself, 20 miles south, outside Selden's county. I will post the letters from there." Lenore looked at him. The man who had spent 12 years protecting his brother by hiding him from the world was now protecting his brother by riding into the world. Not running from the danger, running toward it, not hiding the truth, carrying it. He left before dark. He rode through Coldwater without stopping past the darkened windows of the general store and the sheriff's office and the small closed house where Martha Cruz lived alone with a piano and an empty chair. He rode south through the night, through the mountain dark that he knew better than anyone alive, because he had lived inside it for 12 years and it held no secrets from him. On the trail nailed to a pine tree at the junction where the road split toward Carson Creek, a campaign poster flapped in the wind. "Selden for judge, a man of law and order." Everett looked at it. He did not tear it down. He did not need to. In 3 days, it would not matter what the poster said. In 3 days, the man behind the poster would be answering questions he had spent 8 years making sure nobody asked. Everett rode on, the letters in his coat pocket, the night around him. And for the first time in 12 years, the heaviness in his chest was not the weight of a secret. It was the weight of purpose. Day 10, night, the dove. Callum sat by the fire with the carving in his hands. The first wing was already open, freed from the body of the bird 2 days ago in the amber light of the fireplace while his brother watched and understood what it meant. Now he carved the second wing. The knife moved with the certainty of a man who was no longer waiting for permission. The oak peeled away in thin, translucent curls. The wing emerged, rising, spreading, matching the first. 2 wings open, ready, but the beak was still closed. Lenore sat across from him, the finished testimony in her lap. She watched him work. She watched the dove take shape under his hands. And she understood the metaphor because she had spent her life in a world where silence was not absence, but a condition. A landscape, a country with its own geography and its own rules. "Will you open the beak?" Callum looked up, his eyes bright and steady, and reading her the way they read everything met hers. He signed, "When I finish telling, then it will sing." Day 11, countdown 2 days. They came at dawn. The sound of hooves on the mountain trail reached Lenore first. She was on the porch reviewing the testimony one final time, checking every word against the notes Callum had written, and the signs he had made, and the drawings on scraps of paper that she had collected over 5 days of painstaking translation. She heard the horses before she saw them. Many horses, more than 2, more than 4. She went inside. "Callum, stay in the cabin." He read her lips. He read her face. He read the tension in her shoulders and the way her hands moved to the testimony and pressed it flat against her chest. He stayed. They emerged from the tree line in a loose column. 8 riders, 10. Ward Selden at the front, sitting his horse with the easy posture of a man accustomed to leading. Deputy Goss beside him. Behind them a scattering of townsmen, some on horseback, some on foot. A few faces she recognized from Opal's store. One she did not expect. The town preacher, a thin man with a Bible tucked under his arm, who had been told that a young woman needed saving from 2 dangerous mountain men and their unholy rituals. Selden dismounted. His smile was in place. His suit was clean. His badge caught the early light and threw it back in a bright point of silver. "Everett," He looked around. Everett was not back from Carson Creek yet. Selden's smile widened. Not home well, I am here in my capacity as sheriff and as a concerned neighbor. He looked at Lenore. Miss Ashfield, your father is very worried about you. The town is worried. Living up here with two men, no chaperone, no marriage bond. It is not proper. I think the best thing for everyone is if you come back to Coldwater with us. Lenore stepped off the porch. Her back was straight, her chin was lifted. She was 5 feet 3 inches tall, and she weighed less than the saddle on Selden's horse, and she was not moving. I am 22 years old, Mr. Selden. I do not need anyone to take me anywhere. Selden's expression shifted to practiced concern. Of course, but the town talks. People say you are teaching Callum to well make signs with his hands. Some say it is unnatural. Some say worse. He let the implication hang. Callum is not well. We all know that. He is not capable of understanding what you are doing to him. Lenore's voice did not rise. It did not need to. She had spent years in rooms full of people who believed that silence equaled stupidity, and she had learned to correct them with the precision of a surgeon. I am teaching him American Sign Language, a language used by thousands of Americans since the founding of the Hartford School in 1817. He is not insane, he is deaf. Those are two different conditions, Mr. Selden. A man running for the office of county judge should know the difference. The smile disappeared. 1 second, just one, long enough for Lenore to see what was behind it, long enough for the preacher to see it too, though he would not understand what he had seen until later. Then the smile returned, but it was different now, thinner. The mask still fit, but the face underneath had shifted. Regardless, I have a responsibility to this community. If you will not come voluntarily, I will have to consider other measures. From behind them, from the other direction. From the western trail that wound down from the high pass above the creek, the sound of a single horse, moving fast. Everyone turned. A man on a black hearse broke through the tree line and pulled up at the edge of the clearing. He wore a long black coat and a hard-crowned hat and carried a leather satchel stuffed with documents. His face was weathered and angular, the face of a man who had spent decades riding from town to town across the territory delivering justice to places too small for a permanent court. Judge Clement Sparrow, Circuit Court, Federal Jurisdiction, Western District of Montana Territory. He dismounted. He did not hurry. Judges do not hurry. He walked across the clearing with the measured stride of a man who understood that authority is not volume but certainty. Sheriff Selden. His voice was calm and carried without effort, the voice of a man accustomed to speaking in rooms where everyone was required to listen. I am Judge Sparrow, Federal Circuit Court. I have received a petition requesting that I take testimony from a witness in the matter of the death of one Elias Cruz, a citizen of this county, whose death was ruled accidental 8 years ago. He looked around the clearing. I am here to hear that testimony. Where is the witness? The color left Ward Selden's face. Not slowly, all at once like a cloth being pulled from a table. 8 years of careful planning. 8 years of kind smiles and church donations and campaign posters and a stolen fortune laundered into respectability. 8 years of sleeping peacefully because the only witness was a deaf man on a mountain who could not speak and had no one to speak for him. All of it ended in the time it took a judge to ask a question. Selden recovered. The mask came back, but it came back crooked, and everyone in the clearing could see the seam. Lenore spoke. Her voice was clear. The witness is here. She looked at the cabin door. Callum. And this was not rescue. This was not a miracle. This was not a hero arriving at the last moment to save the day. This was a woman who had written a letter on day 7 and given it to a man who had ridden 20 miles through the mountain dark to make sure it arrived. This was planning. This was patience. This was a teacher who understood that giving someone a voice means nothing if you do not also give them somewhere to be heard. Lenore Ashfield had built this moment one sign at a time, one letter at a time, one lesson at a time from the first day she raised her hands in a cabin doorway and signed, I hear you, to a man who had never been heard. And now the world was going to hear him too. The cabin door opened. Callum Harlow stepped out of the cabin and into the light. The morning sun hit him full in the face. October sun, low and golden, the kind that turns the aspens into torches and makes the granite outcrops glow like old bronze. He stood in the doorway for a moment, one hand on the frame, and he looked at the people in the clearing. 10 of them, maybe 12. More human faces than he had seen in the same place at the same time in 12 years. More eyes on him than he had felt since he was 10 years old and tied to a rope in the town square while strangers laughed at the boy who could not answer when they called his name. He was not 10 anymore. He was 26. He was lean and strong, and his hands the hands of a woodcarver who had spent a decade turning silence into art were the steadiest part of his body. The rest of him was shaking. His knees, his jia, the muscles along his shoulders that tightened when his body wanted to turn and run. But his hands were still. He looked at Lenore. She stood at the base of the porch steps, the testimony pressed against her chest, her face composed with the professional calm of a woman who had spent her entire adult life translating between two worlds. She was his bridge. She was the space between his hands and their ears, the living connection that turned gesture into sound and silence into evidence. She signed to him. Two words, the phrase that had governed their entire relationship from the moment she first raised her hands in this cabin and changed his life. Hands first. The final time, the fourth and last. And this time the meaning was not, let your hands speak before the questions come. This time the meaning was larger, deeper, final. Your hands lead, I follow. You are the one who tells of this story. I am only the one who carries your words from the silence into the sound. Callum stepped off the porch. The crowd parted, not because he was large, though he was taller than most of them. Not because he was threatening, because he was not. They parted because something about the way he moved, the way he crossed the clearing, with his eyes fixed forward and his hands at his sides and his shoulders set against a weight that none of them could see, communicated a purpose so absolute that getting in its way felt like standing in front of a river. Judge Clement Sparrow stood at the center of the clearing. He was a tall man in a long black coat, 55 years old, with a kind of face that had been shaped by decades of listening to testimony in courtrooms, in barns and open fields across the Montana Territory. He had heard liars and truth-tellers and everything in between. He knew the difference. He could feel it in the way a witness held their body, the way their eyes moved, the way their voice, or in this case their hands, carried the weight of what they were saying. He looked at Callum with the measured evaluation of a man whose profession was judgment. You are Callum Harlow, the witness. Lenore signed the words. Callum watched her hands, then looked at the judge. He nodded. You wish to give testimony regarding the death of Elias Cruz 8 years ago. Lenore signed. Callum nodded again. Proceed. Callum raised his hands. What happened next would be talked about in Coldwater for 30 years. It would be told and retold in Opal Bryce's store and on the porches of the houses along the main street and in the church on Sunday mornings, when the sermon was over and the congregation lingered in the autumn sun. The story of the day the deaf man spoke, not with his mouth, with his hands. Callum began, 8 years ago. His hands shaped each sign with the precision of a man who had been rehearsing this moment in his mind for nearly 3,000 nights. Each gesture was clean. Each movement was deliberate. There was no hesitation, no fumbling, no searching for the right sign. He had waited 8 years. He was not going to stumble now. Lenore stood beside him. She translated. Her voice was steady, professional, carrying each word from his hands to the ears of every person in the clearing with the clarity of a bell struck in cold air. 8 years ago, the crowd was silent, not empty silence, pressurized silence. A clearing full of held breath and wide eyes and the dawning awareness that something extraordinary was happening. Trail, East Mountain, the trail on the east side of the mountain. Go, check, traps. I was checking the trap line. I see 2 men. I saw 2 men. Callum's hands moved through the air in front of him. Each sign was a picture. Each gesture was a scene. Oh, this was not language as most people understood it. This was something older and more primal. The human body telling a story the way human bodies had told stories for 10,000 years before anyone thought to write a word down. Movement, shape, direction, force. 1 man, Elias Cruz. Brown horse, white mark on face. 1 man was Elias Cruz. He was riding a brown horse with a white blaze. Somewhere in the clearing a murmur. The name Cruz meant something to these people. It meant a widow who played piano. It meant a chair that had been empty for 8 years. It meant a death that everyone had accepted and no one had questioned. One man, Ward Selden, standing, waiting. The other man was Ward Selden. He was standing on the trail, waiting. Selden stepped forward. His face was a controlled disaster, the mask still in place but cracking at the edges, the smile gone, the warmth gone, only the cold gray eyes left calculating, measuring, searching for a way out that was closing in front of him with every movement of Callum's hands. This is ridiculous. This is the rambling of a man who cannot even speak. You cannot seriously be listening to this. Judge Sparrow did not turn to look at him. He did not raise his voice. He spoke with the quiet authority of a man who had silenced louder objections in rougher courtrooms. I am hearing testimony. You will have your opportunity to respond when the witness is finished. Until then, you will be silent or I will have you restrained. Selden stopped, his jaw worked. His hand moved toward his holster, an unconscious gesture, the reflex of a man who had spent his career using the weight of a badge and a gun to control every situation he entered. But this was not a situation he could control. The man standing in front of him was a federal judge. The badge and the gun meant nothing here. Callum had not stopped. He had not looked at Selden. He had not flinched at the interruption he could not hear. His eyes were on Lenore's face, watching for her signal, the small nod that told him the translation was keeping pace. When she nodded, he continued. Selden, talk. To Cruz, point. At Moneybag, on horse. Selden spoke to Cruz. He pointed at the money bag strapped to the horse's saddle. His hand made the gesture, index finger extended, pointing. The motion was exact, not theatrical, not exaggerated, just precise. The way a man who has replayed a scene in his mind thousands of times can reproduce every detail, because the details have been burned into his memory with the permanence of a brand. Cruz, shake head, no. Cruz shook his head. He refused. Then, gun. Then, the gun. Callum's hand changed shape. It became a pistol. Index finger extended, thumb raised. The oldest sign in any language. The shape that children make in playgrounds, and soldiers make in trenches, and witnesses make in courtrooms, when words alone cannot carry the weight of what they saw. His hand jerked. A single sharp motion. The recoil of a fired weapon translated into flesh and bone and muscle. Someone in the crowd flinched. A physical, involuntary response to a sign so vivid that the body processed it as sound. Because that was the thing about Callum's testimony. It was not words. It was not abstract. It was visual. It was a man using his body to recreate a moment in time, and the recreation was so accurate, so detailed, so saturated with 8 years of obsessive remembrance that watching it was like watching the event itself. Smoke from gun, like gray flower. Smoke from the barrel, like a gray flower opening in the mountain air. Lenore's voice caught on the translation. Not from weakness, from the beauty of the image. A deaf man describing a gunshot he never heard by the only detail available to him, what the smoke looked like as it bloomed from the muzzle. And the image he chose was a flower. Horse, jump, Cruz, fall. The horse bolted. Cruz fell. Both of Callum's hands dropped. Slowly, not the quick collapse of a body losing its balance, the slow, terrible descent of a man losing his life. His hands fell through the air the way Elias Cruz had fallen from his horse on an October morning 80 years ago, and the people watching felt something shift in their chests because they were not hearing a story. They were seeing one. And what they were seeing was a man die. Slow, like tree fall. Slowly, the way a tree falls. Selden, take money bag. Selden took the money bag from the saddle. Callum's hands mimed the action. Reaching, grasping, pulling, stuffing the pound inside a coat. Each motion was small and precise and devastating because each motion was a crime described in a language that could not lie. That was the thing the people in the clearing were beginning to understand. Hands do not lie the way mouths lie. A spoken lie can hide behind inflection, behind charm, behind the 1,000 tricks of voice that humans use to make falsehood sound like truth. But hands have no inflection. Hands have no charm. Hands only have shape and movement and direction, and those things either match reality or they do not. And Callum's hands matched reality with the precision of a key fitting a lock. Drag, body, into, brush. He dragged the body into the brush, two hands pulling something heavy along the ground. The effort visible in the tension of his forearms, the set of his shoulders, the downward angle of his gaze. He was not acting. He was remembering. And the memory was so complete that his body reproduced it without effort, the way a musician reproduces a melody they learned as a child. Chase, horse, downhill. He chased the horse down the slope, one hand waving, pushing the gesture for sending something away. The horse that would be found riderless the next morning. The horse that would become the evidence for an accidental death. The horse that had been the last piece of Ward Selden's careful, methodical 8-year deception. I hide. Behind rock. 20 steps away. I see. His face. I see. Everything. I was hiding behind a boulder. 20 steps away. I saw his face. I saw everything. Callum paused. His hands came down. He stood in the clearing with the morning light on his face and the mountains behind him, and 12 people staring at him with expressions that ranged from shock to grief to fury, and he breathed. Then he raised his hands one more time. I, afraid. 8 years. Was afraid for 8 years. The sign for afraid. Both hands springing open before the chest. The same sign Lenore had taught him on the third day. The day his hands had trembled when he made the gesture, and his eyes had turned toward the valley, and she had known without asking that his fear was not abstract. He signed it once, clean, clear. Today, not afraid anymore. Today, I am not afraid anymore. His hands came down, slowly, gently. They settled at his sides, palms open, fingers relaxed. The posture of a man who had put down something heavy. The posture of a man who was finished. Not finished speaking, finished carrying. The clearing was silent. 12 people stood in the October sun on a mountaintop in Montana, and nobody breathed. Nobody moved. Nobody looked away from the man who had just told a story without making a sound, and nobody would ever think of him the same way again. Not the deaf man, not the mute, not the idiot on the mountain. The witness, the man who saw, the man who remembered. The man whose hands had just done what 8 years of silence and fear and isolation had tried to prevent. They had spoken the truth. Judge Sparrow wrote in his ledger, methodical, precise, each word set down in the careful hand of a man who understood that what he was recording would be read in courts and offices and records for years to come. He finished writing. He blotted the ink. He closed the ledger. Then he looked at Ward Selden. Sheriff Selden, based on the testimony of this witness, I am ordering your immediate detention pending a full investigation into the death of Elias Cruz. He paused. Give Deputy Goss your badge and your weapon. Selden stared at the judge, then at Callum, then at the crowd that had come up the mountain to rescue a young woman from 2 dangerous hermits and had instead watched a deaf man dismantle the most respected citizen in Coldwater with nothing but his hands. He had had 8 years. 8 years of being certain that the only witness to his crime would never speak. 8 years of sleeping soundly because the boy on the mountain was trapped inside a silence so complete that no evidence could ever escape it. He had built his entire second life on that silence. His career, his reputation, his campaign for judge, all of it resting on the assumption that Callum Harlow could never find a voice. He had not accounted for a woman with a cameo brooch in a textbook in her traveling bag who knew how to turn silence into testimony. Selden removed his badge. He placed it in Goss's outstretched hand. He unbuckled his gun belt and handed it over. His face was empty. The mask was gone, and there was nothing behind it, just the face of a man who had run out of smiles. They led him away on his own horse, down the mountain, through the trees, past the clearing where 2 brothers had lived. For 12 years in a silence that was never really silent at all. The crowd dispersed. Some walked down the trail, some rode. The preacher lingered, looking at Lenore with an expression that mixed shame with wonder, then followed the others without speaking. Deputy Goss led Selden's horse by the reins, his face blank with the particular emptiness of a man who has just discovered that the person he followed was not who he believed. The clearing emptied. The dust settled. The cabin was quiet. Judge Sparrow tightened the strap on his saddlebag and turned to Lenore. Miss Ashfield. She looked up. She was still holding the written testimony against her chest, though it was no longer needed. The real testimony had been given in the air in the space between Callum's hands and the ears of 12 witnesses, and no piece of paper could improve on what those hands had said. I have been a circuit judge in this territory for 18 years, Sparrow said. I have heard testimony from ranchers and miners and soldiers and Crow elders and convicted murderers. I have never heard testimony like that. He paused. The way you prepared that young man, the precision of the language, the legal framework of the written petition you sent me, that is not the work of an amateur. Lenore said nothing. She waited. Philadelphia has a growing need for qualified sign language interpreters in the federal court system. I know the Chief Justice of the Eastern Circuit. I can write you a letter of recommendation that would guarantee you a position. Stable work, good salary, professional respect. He looked at her. You should go back east. The skills you have are rare. They would be valued. Lenore looked at the cabin. Through the open door, she could see Callum. He was sitting at the carving bench, his back to the clearing, his hands working. The knife moved against the oak with the small, careful strokes of a man who was not in a hurry. She could see the dove in his hand. The two wings were open, and he was carving the beak. Opening the beak, she watched his hands, the same hands that had just stood in front of 12 strangers and a federal judge, and told a story that destroyed a sheriff's career and solved an 8-year-old murder. Those hands were now doing something gentler. They were finishing a piece of work that had waited 3 years for this moment. The beak opened, slowly under the blade. A small gap appeared between the upper and lower mandible of the dove. Not wide, just enough to suggest that the bird was about to sing. Lenore looked at Everett. He was standing by the cabin door, not blocking it, not guarding it, not scanning the tree line for threats, just standing. His massive shoulders were lower than she had ever seen them. His hands hung at his sides, open, unclenched. His face held an expression she had not seen in the 12 days she had known him. Rest. The face of a man who had been carrying something for 12 years and had just set it down. Lenore turned back to the judge. Thank you, Judge Sparrow. That is a generous offer. She paused. The aspens shivered in a gust of wind that came down from the peak and carried the smell of pine resin and cold granite. But Philadelphia has many interpreters. Coldwater Peak has one. She paused again. Longer this time, and I have not finished teaching. Sparrow looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. The nod of a man who recognized a decision that had been made before it was spoken, a decision that lived in the body before the mouth could shape it. He mounted his horse. He tipped his hat. He rode down the mountain without looking back. Lenore stood in the clearing alone. The dust from Sparrow's horse hung in the golden air. The mountains rose around her in their ancient, unconcerned silence. And behind her in the cabin, the sound of a carving knife on oak continued steady and sure. The sound of a man finishing something he had started 3 years ago, when he had begun to carve a bird that could not sing and did not know then that the reason it could not sing was that no one had yet taught it how. The afternoon light came through the cabin window at a low angle, turning the sawdust in the air to gold. The carving bench was clean. Callum's tools were arranged in their precise row. The wood shavings had been swept into a pile near the stove, where they would be used as kindling tomorrow morning. Everett sat across from Lenore at the table. Callum was outside, sitting on the porch steps with the finished dove in his hands, turning it slowly in the light, examining each detail with the critical eye of an artist who needed to be certain that the work was complete before he let it go. The cabin was quiet. The fire was low. Everett looked at his hands. He spread them on the table in front of him, palms down. They were enormous hands, scarred, calloused. The nails were cracked and the knuckles were thick, and the skin was weathered to the color and texture of old leather. They were hands that had built a cabin and killed bears and split 1,000 cords of firewood and held a 10-year-old boy while strangers threw rocks. They were not hands that anyone would associate with gentleness or precision or the delicate art of shaping air into meaning. Teach me. Lenore looked up from the notebook where she was writing the day's observations, a habit she had maintained since the first morning. Teach you what? Everett did not look up from his hands. He studied them the way a man studies tools that he suspects might be inadequate for the job ahead. The signs, the real ones. He was quiet for a moment. 12 years I talked to my brother with 60 signs I made up. I thought that was enough. I thought I was giving him everything he needed. He paused again. His jaw worked. You taught him a real language in 10 days. And in those 10 days, he said more than he said in 12 years with me. His voice was not bitter. That was the remarkable thing. There was no resentment in it, no jealousy, no wounded pride, only a kind of awe. The awe of a man who has watched someone do easily what he had struggled to do for over a decade, and who has the grace to admire rather than resent. I want to learn, so that when you are busy, when you are teaching other things, when you are not in the room, I can still understand him. He looked up. His dark eyes were wet, in his language, not in the one I made up for him. Lenore's eyes filled. She blinked. She nodded. She taught him the simplest signs first. Brother, the right fist placed against the forehead, then brought down to meet the left fist. A sign that contains the entire relationship in a single gesture. Forehead to forehead. Mind to mind. Everett tried it. His hands were too big. His fingers were too stiff. The sign came out clumsy the way a bear might look trying to thread a needle. He did it again. Closer. Again. Almost right. Again. Right. Lenore watched him repeat the sign, and she thought of all the students she had taught in her father's school. Children who had never spoken a word. Children who had been locked in basements and tied to beds and called animals by people who were supposed to love them. She had watched those children learn their first signs, and she had seen the moment when language entered their bodies and changed them from the inside out. She was seeing it now. In a 32-year-old man with hands like sledgehammers and a heart that had been breaking quietly for 12 years. One more, she said. She taught him the sign that had started everything. The sign she had made on her first day in this cabin, standing in the doorway with dust on her dress and a letter in her bag, looking past Everett's enormous blocking frame to the young man at the carving bench who had never been heard by anyone outside his own family. I hear you. Everett signed it, slowly. His thick fingers moved through the air with the uncertain grace of someone learning to dance. The movements were imprecise. The angles were wrong. The rhythm was off, but the meaning was there. The meaning was unmistakable. Because meaning does not live in precision. Meaning lives in intention. And Everett Harlow's intention in this moment was the purest thing in the cabin. He signed it again. Better. Again. Close enough. Then he stood up. He walked to the door. He opened it. He stepped onto the porch. Callum was sitting on the top step. The finished dove was in his hands. It was beautiful. The oak had been sanded to a satin smoothness, and the grain ran through the body of the bird in waves that suggested feathers, suggested flight, suggested the upward motion of something that had been earthbound for too long. The wings were open, spread wide, catching the light, and the beak was open. Not wide, not a shout, a song. The small, precise opening of a mouth that has found the note it was meant to sing. Callum held the dove in the afternoon light and turned it slowly, and for the first time in 3 years, the bird was complete. Nothing pressed flat, nothing sealed shut, nothing held back. Everett stood in front of his brother. Callum looked up. The extraordinary, perceptive, unbearably alive eyes that had spent 26 years learning to read the world without sound. They read Everett now. They read the wetness on his cheeks. They read the set of his womb. They read the way his massive hands were hanging at his sides, not clenched, not fisted, not ready to fight or hold or restrain, ready to speak. Everett raised his hands. They were shaking. He had used these hands to fight, to build, to survive everything the mountain had thrown at him for 12 years. None of that had made them shake. But this simple thing, 4 small signs, in a language he had learned 20 minutes ago, made them tremble like he was holding something that might break. Because what he was about to do was harder than any of those things. Harder than fighting. Harder than building. Harder than surviving. He was about to speak to his brother in a language he had not invented, did not control, and could barely pronounce. He was about to say, "You have outgrown me, and I am going to grow with you." He signed. American Sign Language, the formal, standardized, universally recognized language of the deaf community of the United States. Not the 60 rough signs of 2 brothers on a mountain. not the private, limited dialect of survival and necessity. The real language. Callum's language. I, here, you. The signs were imperfect. The angles were slightly off. The hands were too large and the movements were too slow, and a teacher would have corrected at least 3 errors in the 4-word sentence. But Callum did not see errors. Callum saw his brother's hands moving through the air in a shape that was not their shape, a language that was not their language, and he understood what that meant. He understood that the man who had spent 12 years building walls around him was now learning to build doors, that the man who had protected him by keeping the world out was now learning to bring himself in. Callum stood up. He held the finished dove out in front of him, resting on his open palms, wings spread, beak open. 3 years of waiting finished. He placed it in Everett's hands. The oak was warm. Callum's body heat was still in it, soaked into the grain the way the sun soaks into stone. Everett held the bird and felt the warmth and looked at his brother and did not say anything because for once, for the first time in 12 years of trying to protect and failing to understand, there was nothing left to say. The narrator of this story will not describe what Everett's face looked like in that moment. Some things are too private for description. Some things belong only to the two people who share them, standing on a porch in the late afternoon light of a Montana autumn, holding a small wooden bird between them like a promise. The wind moved through the pines. The aspens flickered their gold coins against the blue. And on Coldwater Peak, in the silence that had always been there but was no longer lonely, two brothers stood in the same language for the first time in their lives. 1 week later, Callum Harlow walked down the main street of Coldwater for the first time in 12 years. Lenore was beside him. Everett was on his other side. Not in front, not blocking the way. Beside. The three of them walked abreast on the dirt street past the feed store and the livery stable and the church where Ward Selden had donated a bell that rang every Sunday morning, paid for with money he had taken from a dead man's saddle. The town watched. Faces appeared in windows. People paused on the wooden sidewalk. A man stopped loading his wagon and stood with a sack of flour in his arms and stared. Nobody threw rocks. Nobody called names. Nobody tied a rope around anyone's neck. Whether this was because they had heard what happened on the mountain or because they were simply older and less cruel than they had been 12 years ago, or because the sight of the deaf man walking between his brother and the woman with the signing hands carried a dignity that made cruelty feel small, nobody could say. They walked to Opal Bryce's store. Opal was standing in the doorway. She looked at Callum and her eyes went wet, and she said nothing because Opal Bryce had survived 62 years on the Montana frontier by knowing when to speak and when to let the moment be what it was. A woman was waiting outside the store. Martha Cruz was 50 years old. Her hair had gone silver early the way hair does when grief accelerates the body's calendar. She wore a black dress. She had been wearing black for 8 years, and the fabric had faded to the color of a bruise, dark and deep and permanent. She was standing very still with her hands clasped in front of her. She had heard. The whole town had heard. The deaf man on the mountain had testified. The sheriff had been arrested. And the death of Elias Cruz, her husband, the man she had loved, the man whose chair still sat empty beside her piano, had not been an accident. She looked at Callum. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. She was trying to find words, and the words were not cooperating because the thing she needed to say was too large for ordinary language. You are the one who told the truth about my husband. Callum looked at Lenore. Lenore signed the words. Callum watched her hands, then turned back to Martha. He signed. Lenore translated, her voice barely above a whisper. I am sorry that I was silent for so long. Martha's eyes spilled over. She did not wipe the tears. She let them fall. 8 years. 8 years I thought Elias fell from his horse. 8 years I blamed him for being careless on a mountain trail. 8 years I was angry at a dead man for leaving me alone because he could not ride a horse properly. Her voice broke. And now I know. He was not careless. He did not fall. He was killed. And I spent 8 years being angry at the person I loved most in the world for something that was not his fault. She reached out and took Callum's hands. Both of them. Her small piano player's hands wrapping around the long, precise fingers of the woodcarver. She held them the way Lenore had held them in the cabin the day he told the story for the first time. Held them still. Held them tight. You gave me the truth. After 8 years of living in a lie I did not know was a lie, you gave me back my husband, not alive but real, the real version of how he died. And now I can remember him the right way. Callum did not sign anything. He did not need to. He held Martha Cruz's hands in his, and he nodded once, and that was enough. The narrator of this story will tell you one more thing about Martha Cruz, and then she will leave this story because she was never meant to stay in it long. She was meant to arrive at exactly this moment, stand in exactly this light, say exactly these words, and remind every person listening that the truth does not only free the people who tell it, it frees the people who hear it. That afternoon, Martha Cruz went home to the small, closed house on the main street of Coldwater. She sat down at the piano. She looked at the empty chair beside the bench, the chair where Elias had sat every evening for 10 years of marriage, turning the pages of the sheet music with hands that smelled of leather and pine, and the wild places where he earned his living. She picked up the chair. She carried it to the other room. She did not throw it away. She did not burn it. She set it by the window where the afternoon light came in, and she put a cushion on it. And that evening, for the first time in 8 years, she sat at the piano and played without looking at the empty space beside her. Not because she had forgotten Elias, because she finally remembered him correctly. Coldwater Peak, morning. The last morning of this story. The cabin sat in the early light the way it had sat for 12 years, solid and patient, its log walls dark with age and weather, its single window facing east to catch the first sun. The aspens on the ridge below had turned their full October gold, and the wind moved through them with a sound like 10,000 small hands, applauding something that only the trees could see. Inside the cabin, the fire was lit. The stove was warm. The carving bench was clean. The tools aligned, the shavings swept. On the windowsill facing outward, a small wooden dove sat in the morning light. Its wings were open. Its beak was parted. It looked out over the valley with the posture of a bird that was not perched but paused. A bird that had somewhere to go and was choosing for this one moment to stay. Callum sat at the carving bench, the same position as the first scene of this story, the same bench, the same window, the same light. But everything else was different. In the first scene, he had been sitting with his back to the door, turned away, closed off, facing the wall of a cabin that was both his home and his prison, working on a bird that would never sing, holding a secret that would never be told, waiting for something he did not know was coming. Now he faced the door. His chair was turned outward. His body was oriented toward the opening, toward the light, toward the world that came through it. On the bench before him was a new block of oak, fresh and pale, and he was carving something new. The shape was not yet clear. The knife was still finding the form inside the wood. But his hands moved without hesitation, without doubt, without the careful restraint of a man who was afraid that what he was making would never be finished. Beside him on a stool pulled close to the bench, Lenore sat with her ASL textbook open on her lap. Between the pages, pressed flat like a flower, was the letter. The first letter. The one Callum had written to bring her here, the letter with the beautiful handwriting and the precise sentences and the soul of a man who had poured everything he could not say into ink and paper. She was reading his most recent note, the one he had left on her table that morning, as he left a note every morning, a daily practice of written communication that had become the rhythm of their days. You came because of the letter. You stayed because of the hands. I do not know how to say the word for love, but I can carve it. She smiled. She did not sign anything. She did not write anything back. She sat beside him and watched his hands work and let the morning be what it was. Everett came through the door. He was carrying an armload of pine logs for the stove, freshly split, the cut surfaces pale and fragrant. He set them down beside the fire. He straightened up. He looked at his brother and the woman sitting together at the bench, two people building a language between them that grew larger every day. Then Everett signed. American Sign Language. Slow, careful. The thick fingers moving through unfamiliar shapes with the determined concentration of a man who has decided that learning is not a thing that stops when you are 32 years old. Good. Morning. Two signs, two words, imperfect, slightly off angle, but correct, recognizable, real. Callum looked up from his carving. His eyes, the eyes that had carried the burden of sight for a lifetime without sound, met his brother's eyes. And he signed back, good. Morning, the same words, the same signs, the same language. For the first time in their lives, two brothers said good morning to each other, and both of them understood fully and completely what the other one meant. The fire crackled. The wind moved through the pines. The aspens applauded their silent golden applause. And the narrator of this story will leave them here, in this cabin, in this light, in this silence that is no longer silence, but the space between two languages, learning to become one. Callum Harlow lived 26 years without a voice, not because he had nothing to say. He had more to say than most people who spend their lives talking. He lived without a voice because no one around him had the language to listen, until a woman carrying a letter stepped through a cabin door and raised her hands. On the windowsill of the cabin on Coldwater Peak, a small wooden dove looked out over the valley. Its wings were spread, its beak was open. It did not sing, it would never sing. It was made of oak, and oak does not make sound. But anyone who looked at it carefully, anyone who took the time to see the way the wings caught the light and the way the open beak was angled slightly upward, as if the bird were listening to something only it could hear, would understand. It did not need to sing. It had wings.